Over the last 10 years, I've written extensively about the concepts of transgender social contagion and rapid onset gender dysphoria. Last month, I gave a keynote talk in which I was able to synthesize much of that work and connect it to false accusations that trans and LGBTQ people are grooming children and other sexual predator tropes. What follows is an audio recording, edited for length, that I made of that talk, along with corresponding slides. About a third of the way through, I will chime in to provide a few extra slides and information that I didn't have time to fit into the original live presentation. I should also mention that this talk took place at a queer analytic philosophy conference. You don't need to know anything about that field to appreciate the talk, as I tried to keep it as accessible as possible. But that context hopefully explains why I made a few esoteric philosophy jokes along the way. As always, please like the video so that more people see it, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and consider supporting my work on Patreon. Thank you. Thank you for the lovely introduction. And thank you to all the organizers for putting on this conference, which has been amazing, and for inviting me. I feel very honored to be here. So my talk today is entitled, Is Queerness Contagious? On Sex, Stigma, and Imagined Contamination. And it evolved out of two seemingly different research interests of mine that over time became unexpectedly intertwined, so much so that I now consider them to be like different manifestations of the same underlying phenomenon. And so today I'm going to share that story and what I've learned from it. So the first of the two research interests involves the way in which trans people, and especially like trans women and trans feminine people, tend to be sexualized or hypersexualized in our culture. And I first wrote about this way back in a chapter in Whipping Girl, but in my most recent book, Sexed Up, I explore how we perceive and interpret sex and sexuality, including many of the arbitrary assumptions and meanings we tend to project onto it. And in addition to that, I strive to explain why all marginalized groups tend to be sexualized in one way or another, and why reducing people to their real or imagined sexual attributes tends to have a delegitimizing or degrading effect on them. So I will share all my thoughts on all that in the second half of the talk. But I'm going to begin with the second research interest, which arose out of a weird little hobby of mine. Some people collect stamps, other people take up knitting, whereas I like to spend my time debunking anti-trans junk science and pseudoscience. It's a very weird, sad hobby. So it began with my critiques of Ray Blanchard's theory of autogynephilia, and in the article in the upper left, it collects all my writings on that topic, which include two different peer-reviewed critical reviews explaining the many ways in which the theory is incorrect. And I'm sorry to say this, but sadly that theory is going to make like a brief walk-on entry later in the talk. So I just put that out there. But we won't spend too much time on it. And then when the current anti-trans movement began to garner momentum in the mid-2010s, they seemed determined to present all of their prejudices and presumptions as though they are science, which frankly offends me as a scientist, not to mention as a trans person. So I felt compelled to correct the record whenever I can. And so these are all different examples that you can find on the writing page of my website. And but of the many pseudoscientific claims they have made, the one that I have found most vexing, and that I'll focus on here today, is the notion that transgender identities are now spreading among children due to social contagion. Now, when I first heard this proposed in like 2017, it struck me as preposterous, because like I've been living as an out trans person, not to mention before I transitioned like 25 years ago. I've been interacting with cisgender people nonstop since then, many of whom are children. Nonstop. Okay, I didn't know that would be funny, but okay. It's almost as sad as having the hobby of like debunking like anti-trans pseudoscience. Okay, so anyway, and so I've interacted with all these cisgender people, but none of them have turned transgender due to those interactions. So if like transness is a contagion, it's a very inefficient one. Okay. So over the last decade, I've written about this topic on many occasions, sometimes in depth, other times tangentially. Most of these essays here appeared on Medium, and because I wanted them to be accessible to the public. And like I said, links to them can be found on my writings webpage or on my Medium site. And if you were to read just one, I would encourage you to read Lies, Damned Lies, and Transgender Statistics, as it's the most recent and comprehensive. Plus, at the end of this essay, I list over a dozen peer-reviewed studies contradicting the transgender social contagion hypothesis and its doppelganger rapid onset gender dysphoria. So, proponents of transgender social contagion typically ignore all this counter-evidence, or they'll claim that the contradictory evidence nevertheless proves their theory. The example that sparked this particular essay is that for the longest time, they've been arguing that one of their main proofs that transgender social contagion is happening is that the number of young people identifying as trans has been rising over the years. But then, last year when there was one report, a specious report, came out saying that there's been a decrease in people identifying as trans, they argued that that also proved that social contagion was happening. Endlessly frustrating, which is why I have no qualms calling this pseudoscience. Now, while it's not surprising that hardcore anti-trans activists would continue to cling to their talking points long after they're refuted, the reason why I describe transgender social contagion as vexing, and the reason why I've taken such interest in it, is that the cisgender majority, it really resonates with them, even with those who consider themselves pro-trans. On numerous occasions when I've shared the counter-evidence with such individuals, they've responded with something like, well, I still think it might be happening, or I still think we should take social contagion seriously. So I've spent a lot of time trying to understand why people find the idea that transness is contagious so compelling. So with the rest of the talk, I will first provide a brief overview of all the evidence against transgender social contagion. Then I will discuss the dark turn the theory has taken in recent years. Finally, I will connect the social contagion story back to my work on transsexualization, and I will argue that both are driven by what I've come to call the stigma-contamination mindset. So, we'll begin, since this is an analytic philosophy conference, I thought we should begin by unpacking the term social contagion. Because if you ask, because if you ask people who bandy about the phrase to define it, they often have difficulties. It turns out that social contagion is quite an old term that originated in sociology and is sometimes invoked in psychology. It has been long critiqued for its vagueness and for conflating many potential social influences. One of these social influences is what's been called a reduction of restraints. Specifically, if there is a social norm prohibiting a particular behavior, many people who are inclined to engage in said behavior may refrain from doing so. In queer communities, we colloquially call this being in the closet. But once that social restraint is lifted, for instance, if society becomes more tolerant or accepting of trans or LGBTQ people, then many of these same people may start publicly expressing themselves for the first time, which onlookers may misperceive as a rapid increase due to social contagion. Indeed, there's a general consensus in the fields of trans healthcare and LGBTQ demographics that the increases in youth identifying as trans and LGBTQ more generally over the last couple decades is due to a reduction in stigma associated with being queer, in tandem with an increase in information, awareness, and access to trans healthcare and LGBTQ communities that did not exist for previous generations. So in my recent essay, shown here, I called this the Stigma Reduction, Increased Awareness and Access Explanation, or SRIAA for short. As much as I normally hate acronyms like this, I think it's crucial to have some kind of label for the consensus hypothesis so that people don't mistake social contagion as the only possible explanation. And if you have better ideas for acronyms, please let me know. I would totally entertain them. Another social influence that the concept of social contagion obscures is homophily, the tendency for people who are alike in certain ways to associate with one another. And here are a couple papers discussing this and why it confounds studies on social contagion. In her infamous 2018 study of so-called rapid onset gender dysphoria, Lisa Littman described peer groups of children that included multiple trans kids as, quote, cluster outbreaks of transgender identification. Completely oblivious to the fact that trans kids are likely to gravitate with one another because of shared experiences and or for mutual support. Given her reactions to trans kids having trans friends, I'm sure Littman would be astonished by a gathering like this today. I mean, face it, queer people make up less than 10% of the population, so it's statistically impossible that so many of us would all wind up here in the same auditorium tonight. So welcome to the cluster outbreak. Here's another type of social influence to consider. If I were to read a book that I found to be smart or funny or uplifting or interesting, and I told you about it, and you read it, and you recommended it to other people, is that social contagion? Well, I mean, technically it should, shouldn't it? But the thing is, most people wouldn't call that social contagion because it's considered normal and natural, and therefore unremarkable, for positive ideas and behaviors to catch on and spread among people. In contrast, in my literature searches, I found studies claiming that all the following phenomena are supposedly spread by social contagion: divorce, obesity, loneliness, poor sleep, gun violence, bullying, cyberbullying, eating disorders, and suicide. While the occasional study claiming that happiness is spread by social contagion will crop up from time to time, the overwhelming majority focus on things that are viewed negatively, at least in the eyes of the researchers studying them. And I don't think this is an accident. In fact, the sociologists who originally coined behavioral contagion and social contagion in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they were trying to explain mob behavior, why crowds of people often act irrationally and destructively. So it seems to me that the concept of social contagion is steeped in negativity bias. This is our tendency to dwell more on negative outcomes than positive or neutral ones, and to attribute negative outcomes to some external agent. Or to put it another way, we often presume that positive or neutral events occur naturally or inexplicably, whereas negative events must have been caused by something or someone. Unfortunately, as you are all well aware, most people in our culture view being transgender as a bad thing, whether it be a sin or abomination, or some kind of defect or an unfortunate fate that has befallen us. And because they view it as bad, they'll presume that it must have been caused by some kind of external agent in accordance with negativity bias. This is why there is a seemingly endless list of proposed causes of transness. I've collected a few of them on this slide. I'm sure there are many more than this. In contrast, few people outside of academia are interested in what causes people to become cisgender. As that outcome is deemed normal, natural, and unremarkable. It's fine, it's fine. You can process. I can take another sip of water. It's all good. Let your feelings out.
That list is a lot.
But as soon as someone comes out as transgender, everyone will immediately strap on their detective caps and insist on getting to the bottom of that. Or if you'll allow me to put it another way, by most counts, cisgender people make up greater than 99% of the population. It's widespread, an outbreak, an epidemic. Plus, there is well-documented social pressure placed on both children and adults to constantly push them toward gender conformity. Yet no one would ever call this social contagion because they view it as a positive or neutral outcome. So before moving on, I should point out that social contagion has ramifications that many of these other proposed causes of transness do not. If I turn out to be trans because I had a dominant mother or was exposed to feminizing chemicals, well, that's a me thing, right? That wouldn't affect you. However, if my transness was socially contagious, then that could affect you. You might be concerned that I might turn you or someone close to you transgender. These fears might lead you to suggest that we quarantine trans children, or prevent trans adults from participating in the public sphere in order to ensure that our transness doesn't spread further. This right here is the reason why anti-trans activists favor this proposed cause over others, because it aligns with their preferred policy goals of eliminating us from society. So hopefully that has convinced you that the concept of transgender social contagion was irreparably flawed from the start. But wait, there's more. So in 2019, I published this article, Origins of Social Contagion and Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria. It is essentially a massive timeline that I created by doing advanced Google searches, back when Google still worked, looking for the earliest mentions of transgender social contagion online. Some of my findings are highlighted here. So basically, the concept was invented in February 2016 on the anti-trans website Fourth Wave Now. The first post about it was called "Tumblr Snags Another Girl, but her therapist's mom knows a thing or two about social contagion." So subsequent evidence I also uncovered with the help of other people indicates that the author was Lisa Marciano, who has since become a prominent anti-trans activist who's devoted to eliminating gender-affirming care for trans youth and young adults. In fact, from my research, I think she also coined the idea back around the same time that the brain doesn't fully develop to 25, so gender-affirming care shouldn't be allowed for anyone up until the age 25.
So this is where I cut into the talk to provide a little more information. The evidence I just mentioned can be found in the investigative essay on the left. As for her anti-trans activism, Marciano would later become a co-founder of the Gender Exploratory Therapy Association, now called Therapy First, which promotes a form of conversion therapy. And she has served as advisor to both GenSpect and SEGM, organizations that work to undermine or restrict gender-affirming care. Both of these latter groups have been designated as anti-LGBTQ hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center. In the first couple months after transgender social contagion was first proposed, the concept was widely promoted on Fourth Wave Now, another similar anti-transparent website, Transgender Trend, and a third website, Youth Trans Critical Professionals, that Marciano appears to have started. That July, Lisa Littman, who had no prior experience with trans children or trans healthcare, suddenly appeared on the scene to recruit parents from these same three websites for her Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria, or ROGD, survey that formed the basis of her 2018 paper. People often point out that Littman only surveyed parents rather than the actual trans children. But it's even worse than that. These weren't just any parents. They were parents who frequented the very same websites that had invented and were promoting social contagion theory. The following month, in August 2016, a mere 6 months after the idea was first proposed, transgender social contagion and ROGD began spreading throughout conservative media, where they were treated as though they were already settled science. Trans people often joke that these ideas spread as if driven by social contagion. Indeed, the fact that the cisgender majority is so open to the idea that transness is socially contagious, while never contemplating whether skepticism about trans youth's identities and/or anti-trans talking points or pseudoscience may be socially contagious, perfectly illustrates how the concept itself is riddled with negativity bias. While people are more familiar with Littman's ROGD paper, as it garnered a lot of media attention when it was first published, and then again when a correction and apology were issued by the journal the following year, the first academic article on ROGD was actually penned by Marciano and published in a Jungian-themed psychology journal in October 2017. Both Marciano and Littman framed ROGD the same way. It was a supposedly brand new form of gender dysphoria that seems to be caused by social contagion. In other words, they are different facets of the same theory. Despite being merely a theory, the name Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria seemed purposely designed to sound like a specific diagnosis or clinical condition, thus opening the door to reintroducing previously discredited treatments under the following rationale. While conversion therapy and endless psychotherapy may have failed in treating regular old gender dysphoria, they may be effective in treating this new rapid onset form of gender dysphoria. While there are obvious flaws with ROGD theory, it at least provided a readily testable hypothesis. Researchers could ask whether trans youth today are succumbing to gender dysphoria rapidly, as one might expect if they were suddenly infected by trans peers or trans-themed Tumblr posts. It turns out that the answer to that question is no. By my count, at least 8 studies to date have shown that contemporary trans youth typically become aware of their transness many months or even years before they eventually come out to others. A few of these studies also surveyed parents and found that they tend to presume that their child's coming out is contemporaneous with their realization that they're trans, even though this is rarely the case. I compile and directly link to all of these studies in the final section of my Lies, Damned Lies, and Transgender Statistics essay. Other research described in that section include longitudinal studies showing that trans youth's gender identities are just as stable as their cisgender counterparts. Plus, numerous recent studies showing that the rates of transition regret or detransition remain remarkably low, typically in the 1 to 3% range. In other words, it's been 10 years since transgender social contagion and ROGD were first proposed. Yet there hasn't been a massive wave of teenagers and young adults renouncing their trans identities, as proponents once predicted. Thus, the most parsimonious explanation is that contemporary trans kids are indeed actually trans and benefit from gender-affirming approaches. Okay, now back to the talk.
So now we're going to move on away from me refuting transgender social contagion to asking why this idea resonates with so many people. And the key to this came when anti-trans activists suddenly made it all about gender. From the start, Marciano and Littman argued that social contagion and ROGD disproportionately affected young girls, by which they mean boys and transmasculine youth, trans boys and transmasculine youth. I initially presumed this was due to transmasculine invisibility. Since many people conceptualize transness as a trans-feminine phenomenon, the existence of trans-male or transmasculine youth might strike them as some kind of novel development that required explanation. But then, gender-critical activists began quoting all sorts of statistics that made it sound as though recent increases in trans youth were almost entirely due to a rise in trans-male and transmasculine kids. So I looked into it. So I surveyed the data in this 2023 essay, explaining assigned sex ratios in trans children, and I discussed a few newer studies in my Lies, Damned Lies, and Transgender Statistics essay. Long story short, if you look at surveys based on trans identity, there remains roughly a 1-to-1 ratio between transmasculine and transfeminine youth. This is the same ratio that's persisted since at least back in the mid-2000s when I was writing Whippet Girl. Now, there has been a reported increase in referrals for transmasculine adolescents at several gender clinics. And this is undoubtedly where the gender-critical activists are getting their statistics from. But it only tells part of the story. Clinic referrals for pre-adolescent children and for adults remain disproportionately skewed toward trans-feminine people. So the numbers ultimately balance out. One recent study suggested that transmisogyny is likely driving these temporal dynamics, and I made a similar argument in my sex ratio shifts essay. So speaking of misogyny, in that same essay, I discuss how framing transgender social contagion as disproportionately impacting young girls, combined with Marciano and Littman's assertions that these kids are also disproportionately autistic and or have other mental health issues, plays into long-standing sexist and ableist tropes that such individuals are not fully competent to truly understand themselves and to make decisions about their own bodies and lives. But then, Abigail Schreier really turned the gender up to 11 in her 2020 book Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. The book leans heavily into the social contagion and ROGD narrative, describing them as ravaging our girls. Our girls, I think, is significant. The book's introduction is even titled The Contagion. So if you read this book without any prior context, not knowing anything, you would come away with the idea that there are no trans girls, and that trans boys are really girls who are being misled or seduced into being trans by adult trans activists. The only part of the book where trans female and trans feminine people are discussed at length is in a section entitled The Sexologists, Ray Blanchard and J. Michael Bailey, in which they promote the disproved theory of autogynephilia, which, for those of you who are blissfully unaware of this theory, God bless you. So if you don't know, the theory depicts trans women as a type of sexually deviant man. So one would be left with the general impression that there are no actual trans people per se, okay? So what there are young and vulnerable girls who are being seduced into a transgender lifestyle by autogynephilic men. Now, admittedly, Schreier is careful not to explicitly say this, but some of her, let's say, less inhibited gender-critical compatriots have. Okay. The passage on the left is from Krista Peterson's article documenting Kathleen Stock's views on trans people. So apparently, if you did not know, Stock self-identifies as an analytic philosopher. And also, I have to say this. In her book, Material Girls, she has a whole section, not like a paragraph or sentence, a whole section about me and how I popularized gender identity in my Check's Notes 2007 book, Whipping Girl. Which is kind of weird because, like, the term was obviously coined before I was born, and it was codified in the DSM in 1980 when I was in, like, probably 8th grade or something. And, like, so every trans person who transitioned, like, from 1980 on, including me when I transitioned, had to get gender identity disorder as a diagnosis to do anything, right? And then, so that's, like, really, you know, like really stupid, lousy, bad, lazy research just on its own. But then, like, if you actually read Whipping Girl, around chapter 5 is when I first start talking about gender identity, and I explain that I had issues with the term because it conflates a number of different things, right? And so then the rest of the book, I use a completely different term instead of gender identity. So anyway, I just had to get that off my chest. Sorry for the discretion. Now, the quote on the right is from another supposed intellectual giant of the gender-critical world, Helen Joyce. Now, I'm not going to read either of these passages because they're both unhinged and frankly gross. Especially Joyce's, in which she describes trans women as men with boners, which normally, if it was anyone else, I'd assume they simply didn't understand how hormone therapy or bottom surgery works. Except that she published a book that's literally called Trans. So it's unclear whether she's intentionally lying or if she wrote an entire book about something she's completely clueless about, or possibly both. Anyway, both these quotes explicitly say what Abigail Schreier merely implied, that autogynephilic males are convincing vulnerable teenage girls to transition because that's what they get a kick out of. So I've come to call this the gender-critical grand unified theory of transness. And it's become very pervasive in those circles, as it combines their two favorite go-to pseudoscientific theories, autogynephilia and transgender social contagion. And it makes for a perfect little binary. Trans adults are driven by autogynephilia and trans youth by social contagion. The former are predatory men, and the latter are vulnerable girls. And social contagion, which, if you'll remember, originally referred to adolescents reading too much Tumblr and having too many trans friends, has now taken on explicitly sexual connotations. Not coincidentally, this gender-critical grand unified theory of transness dovetails with two other recurring anti-trans talking points that most of us are very familiar with. So the first is the myth that trans women, or men pretending to be trans, are sexually preying on cis women in public restrooms and other sex-segregated spaces. As the essay on the left details, not only is there no evidence that this is happening, but similar baseless claims have been made about lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, black people during Jim Crow-era segregation, as well as other marginalized groups over the years. The second claim is that trans people are grooming children. So in the essay on the right, which is very recent, came out this month, I compiled yet another timeline via advanced Google searches. These are older searches I did. And so of my searches, do you know what I found? That the very first few claims of children being groomed to be transgender appeared in 2015 and 2016 on Fourth Wave Now, the same website that gave us transgender social contagion. Who'da thunk it? By 2019, this grooming charge had been taken up by US evangelical groups who were protesting drag queen story hour events, and they increasingly broadened its meaning to cover virtually any instance in which children are potentially exposed to the existence of LGBTQ people, no matter how indirect or abstract. This includes mere displays of pride flags. So, obviously, flags are not inherently sexual. Nor do flags... Well, okay. Maybe for a few of you, but I mean, I don't think the flags themselves have a sexual orientation. You know, I don't know what their sexual orientation ontology is. You know, whatever. Okay. So in addition to that, flags also don't commit acts of child sexual abuse, which is what's typically implied by the grooming accusation. In other words, many, if not most, accusations that trans and LGBTQ people are grooming children are indistinguishable from previously discussed claims of social contagion. It's as if anything about us, our flags, our Tumblr posts, our mere presence in society, is imagined to infect and corrupt young children, turning them into one of us. And I should add, while I focused on transgender social contagion in this talk, the idea that homosexuality or gay identities spread via social contagion is both quite old, as discussed in the article on the left, and has been making a comeback lately, as I discuss in the article on the right. Not only are grooming and social contagion often synonymous in anti-trans activist minds, but their false accusations of sexual violence are completely nonsensical. So, the bathroom predator trope, so that evokes what feminists would describe as a stranger in the bushes type of rape. That is not only very rare, as sexual violence is usually perpetrated by someone the victim knows, but it's also an entirely different thing from grooming children. And autogynephilia refers to self-directed sexual fantasies of imagining oneself as a woman. Ray Blanchard, who anti-trans activists would insist is 100% correct in his assessments of trans women, he argued that autogynephilic fantasies compete with and often drown out attraction to other people. While he's wrong, that's the guy who has the theory that they like said that. Okay? And on top of that, for Christ's sakes, it has the prefix auto in it, right? How the hell did they get the idea that Blanchard's paraphilia would lead people to assault women in bathrooms and groom children? None of this makes any logical sense, but nevertheless it resonates with people, especially those who dislike or detest us. At a gut level, many people seem to view transness and queerness as both contagious and inherently sexual. Which brings us back to the topic of sexualization. So, what do I mean by sexualization? Admittedly, people sometimes use the term sexualize in different ways. In fact, some of the same anti-trans activists who call trans people groomers will also claim that we sexualize children. So here's the definition that I settled on when writing Sexed Up. Sexualization occurs when a person is non-consensually reduced to their real or imagined sexual attributes, their bodies, behaviors, or desires, to the exclusion of other characteristics. In other words, rather than being viewed as a complex individual with many attributes, the person is reduced to the status of a sexual being. This definition covers a broad spectrum of phenomena that feminists have long critiqued, including sexual objectification, slut-shaming, sexual harassment, and other forms of sexual violence. I've personally experienced all these forms of sexualization since my transition 25 years ago, once other people began presuming that I am a cisgender woman. In contrast, as soon as people learn that I'm a trans woman, they often start sexualizing me in a variety of other ways, such as claiming or insinuating that I'm sexually deviant, or predatory, or hypersexual, or desperate, or undesirable, or a fetish object. Now, notably, some of these additional forms of sexualization are projected onto other minority groups, including other LGBTQ books, not books, well, maybe books, other LGBTQ folks, people of color, people with disabilities, poor and working class people, and so on. I examine many examples of this throughout the book, although I won't have time to get any of them or address any of them here, due to time. I make the case in Sexed Up that all marginalized groups are sexualized to some degree, although the specific stereotypes they may encounter may vary considerably. So why does sexualization occur, and why does it tend to have a delegitimizing or degrading effect on those subjected to it? Well, many feminists have forwarded a narrative, or variations on a narrative, which for simplicity's sake, I will call the attraction objectification model of sexualization. And it goes something like this. So in a patriarchal world, men have historically exploited women for sexual reproduction and to fulfill their own sexual desires. This process often centers on sexually objectifying women, which dehumanizes them, or dehumanizes us, and enables men to discount our perspectives, concerns, and bodily autonomy, which is why many men feel entitled to sexually harass or assault women with impunity and without remorse. Since this is a queer conference, I will point out the often unspoken heteronormative nature of this model. It presumes that men, or most men, are sexually attracted to women, and that this attraction is part of what drives sexualization. This is why I call it the attraction objectification model. Now, this model seems to explain many instances of sexualization, so I won't outright discount it. But I believe that it fails to account for many forms of sexualization that are not centered on sexual attraction or sexual exploitation. So for instance, I first started experiencing street remarks and sexual harassment very early into my transition, when I was still dressing in quote-unquote boy mode, and before I had developed any kind of feminine figure, suggesting that I was being targeted not because my harassers found me attractive, but simply because they perceived me as a woman. Furthermore, when my harassers would make comments about me or my body, it didn't seem like they were praising me as though I was an object. Far more often than not, they seemed intent on provoking a reaction from me, whether it be appreciation, embarrassment, or fear. This is not something one normally does with objects. After all, if a man refers to a woman as a nice piece of ass to her face, it's probably not because he literally sees her as an inanimate piece of ass, but rather because he wants her to know that that's how he regards her. As someone who's been sexualized as both a trans woman and a presumed cis woman, occasions where male harassers have called me a piece of ass or a slut, to me, they don't feel all that different from occasions when homophobes and transphobes have called me a faggot, pervert, or groomer. These are all attempts to delegitimize and degrade me by associating me with sex and or sexual depravity. Since the attraction objectification model doesn't adequately explain these latter facets of sexualization, in Chapter 6 of Sex Up, I propose a non-mutually exclusive stigma model of sexualization. And so in my writings since the book has come out, I have called this the stigma-contamination mindset, as it often drives prejudice in instances that do not involve sexualization. So here is a brief overview. Stigma occurs when a trait, such as transness or queerness, is viewed negatively, so much so that it seems to discredit or spoil the entire individual. Not only are stigmas treated as if they contaminate every aspect of the person in question, their motives, opinions, dispositions, and trustworthiness, but they can also, quote, spread from the stigmatized individual to their close connections. And that quote is from sociologist Irving Goffman, who called this courtesy stigma. Others have called this stigma by association. It's this fear of spreading that leads people to keep their distance from stigmatized individuals and groups, or to socially exclude them entirely. In Sexed Up, I review research carried out by psychologists Paul Rosen, Carol Nemiroff, and colleagues. And this is research that I can't believe hasn't filtered out into more fields, especially kind of, queer and trans studies. So anyway, their research demonstrates that stigma is closely associated in people's minds with contagion. So contagion, this is an actual concept. So it's considered to be a form of magical thinking that's been described across cultures and which leads people to believe that even a brief encounter with a taboo or stigmatized object or person will contaminate them permanently. The research also shows that stigma and contagion are closely associated with feelings of disgust. So I tried to capture this a bit on this slide, which depicts someone who's fully accepted in society, such as an upstanding member of the dominant majority group, who is imagined to be untainted by stigma, and someone who is stigmatized and thus imagined to be contaminating. The fact that people are likely to view stigma as contagious explains a lot of bizarre yet commonplace reactions that trans and queer people often experience, such as straight people who fear that if they get too close to us, if they find us attractive or become intimate with us, that it might somehow make them gay or compromise their own genders in some way. It also seems to be driving these baseless fears of transgender social contagion. Since the stigma-contamination mindset is a recurring pattern of thinking that all humans are susceptible to, it is likely the reason why transgender social contagion continues to resonate with people even when they are presented with all the counter-evidence. Or to put it another way, as I put it in red on this slide, the contagion in transgender social contagion is actually anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ stigma. So what does this have to do with sexualization, though? Well, in our culture, sex and stigma are tightly intertwined. This is why the topic of sex itself is considered by many to be dirty, disgusting, and shameful. And the stigma is built into the predator-prey framework that shapes how we interpret sex. Basically, and I talk about this in the book, and other people have written similar things. So like predator-prey in my mind is that men are viewed as sexual initiators or aggressors, and women are sexual objects that men pursue. So in other words, to paraphrase Monique Wittig, women are sex, whereas men simply take sex from others. This explains why a man can wear shorts or go topless, and few people will read sexual motives into it. But as soon as a woman wears a short skirt or a low-cut top, others will find it scandalous because she's revealing her sex for all to see. Indeed, what feminists have called the virgin whore double bind might better be understood in terms of stigma management. A woman who adequately hides or plays down her sex, such as by dressing modestly, may be able to garner considerable respectability, but those efforts can quickly be undone if someone simply makes remarks about her sexual attributes or imagines sexual proclivities, thereby reminding her and any onlookers of her status, her supposed station in life, sex. On top of this is the fun part, or not fun. On top of this, people tend to view the act of sex as a stigma-contamination event, one in which the man's penis magically bestows sexual stigma upon his partner. While that may sound silly on the surface, it actually, and I explain it well in the book, but if you just think about it, explains many really weird stuff that people think about sex, right? So it imagines why people imagine heterosexual sex to involve the woman being taken or defiled by the act, and these connotations even persist when the act is consensual. It also explains our culture's obsessions with virginity, wherein the woman is imagined to be initially untainted and pure, and then one fleeting sexual experience will somehow spoil her permanently. And if a woman has too much sex or has too many partners, people will say she has been used up or ruined, even though that's not how sex or bodies work. The idea that sex is a penis-centric stigma-contamination event also explains many bizarre... Yes, get that quote down. Use it next time you're hanging out with your friends. They'll love it. The idea that sex is a penis-centric stigma-contamination event also explains many bizarre presumptions that people have about queer sex, such as why many people don't consider lesbian sex to be real sex, as there's no penis involved to impart stigma. Or, this is a very interesting one, as a bisexual, I find this very interesting, why people presume that bisexual men are really gay, but bisexual women are really heterosexual, as these are both categories that are associated with being contaminated by penises. It explains why some lesbians brag about being gold star, read uncontaminated by penises, and why trans-exclusionary feminists constantly bring up trans women's real or imagined penises, evoking fears that they will contaminate otherwise pure women's spaces. Finally, the fact that sex and stigma are so closely intertwined in our culture explains why stigmatized groups tend to be viewed as excessively sexual, to borrow a phrase from sociologist Patricia Hill Collins. This is why a heterosexual couple who engages in public hand-holding or kissing is not considered to be sexual, but a same-sex couple doing the same thing is. If a billboard ad featuring a white, cisgender, thin, able-bodied woman wearing a sexy outfit, many passersby wouldn't even notice it. But if the model were black, or transgender, or fat, or disabled, or some combination thereof, it might strike them as sexually inappropriate. Or to put it another way, because sex is infused with stigma, stigmatized groups are often viewed as inherently sexual. This not only leads marginalized groups to be hypersexualized in all sorts of ways, such as being viewed as sexually deviant or promiscuous or desperate or fetish objects, but it also explains why the sexual predator trope is so routinely and baselessly projected onto marginalized groups. Those who accuse us of being supposed rapists or groomers never need to provide any actual evidence of sexual violence because their claims operate at a visceral gut level via the stigma-contamination mindset. And so one last thought before I move to the conclusion. It's worth considering who is constructed as vulnerable and in need of protection in these campaigns. It's almost always women and children. But not just any women and children, only women and children of the dominant majority group, who are imagined to be pure and untainted by the stigma in question. In contrast, marginalized women and children are routinely accused of being sexual predators and being sexually corruptive. So examples related to the anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ campaigns I've been describing here include lesbians, who social conservatives have long depicted as rapists and a sexual threat to women and girls, especially in restrooms and locker rooms, and young trans girls who face similar accusations in those same spaces. So the article on the right here is by sociologist Amy Stone, who examines how young trans girls are routinely adultified in right-wing discourses, treated as though they are just as dangerous and threatening as adult members of the group, in order to smear these children as sexual predators. Thus, the people who push these child protectionist claims are hypocrites twice over. They claim to be concerned about the children, when in actuality, they only care about a subset of them, the ones they consider their own. Which is why I think it's very important that Abigail Schreier refers to the girls as our girls, right? And while they raise fears about children being inappropriately sexualized, they are the ones who are adultifying marginalized children and projecting sexual meanings and motives onto them. Okay, so we're in the conclusion now, so we'll be able to take a deep breath in a minute. So hopefully this talk has given you an appreciation for the stigma-contamination mindset, which leads trans and queer people, as well as other marginalized groups, to be viewed as both contagious and excessively sexual, thus driving both the transgender social contagion and the anti-LGBTQ grooming moral panics. When anti-trans and LGBTQ activists claim that we sexualize children, they're not actually talking about child sexual abuse, for which there is no evidence, or even sexualization as most feminists would define it. Rather, they're telling us that they view cisgender and heterosexual people as pure, and they imagine trans and queer people as contaminated and sexually corrupted. So, when a child comes out as trans or some other LGBTQ identity, they automatically presume that someone or something must have sexually corrupted them. This is pure magical thinking, and no reasonable person should ever take these claims seriously. The stigma-contamination mindset can help us to better explain and understand and convey to the rest of the world just how extreme and disproportional the current anti-trans movement has become. So I've encountered many diehard anti-trans activists online, and the three traits that most typify them are that they are obsessed. In many cases, their entire timeline is filled with anti-trans propaganda. They are aggrieved. They feel wronged or harmed by the mere presence or existence of trans people. And they are paranoid. They imagine that we are all an all-powerful cabal, or they read gender ideology into people and events that have nothing to do with us. While these are not rational reactions to a historically marginalized group that comprises less than 1% of the population, these might seem like appropriate reactions if you actually believed that there's an insidious force out there that's attempting to contaminate and permanently corrupt you or your family or society more generally. Finally, the stigma-contamination mindset also helps to explain what some have called the TERF to fascist pipeline. And others have referred to it as Riley's Law, which if you haven't heard it before, it's an online saying that goes, once you post transphobia, you never post normally again. And it's sad how true it is. Here's my interpretation. Once you start viewing one minority group as literally contagious and a sexual threat to the imagined purity and safety of your own in-group, then it becomes super easy to project that same template onto another marginalized group, or two, or three. While there are many facets to fascist and far-right thinking, a major recurring theme involves stigmatized outsiders, whether they be immigrants, people of color, people with disabilities, non-Christians, and of course gender and sexual minorities, as an imagined contaminating force that is insidiously corrupting society and the traditional family, and which must be eradicated for the greater good. This is what allows them to perpetually cast themselves as the victim, even when they are members of the dominant majority group in society. While all of us are susceptible to this stigma-contamination mindset on occasion or to varying degrees, the far right is primarily driven by it. And once people understand how it works, its obsession with purity, contagiousness, and sexual corruption, they may finally be able to grapple with it and counteract its eliminationist intentions. So I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you for your time.